The massive crystalline halls of the Galactic Assembly buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from thousands of worlds gathered for what many considered the most important session in galactic history. Ambassador Ra of the Empire adjusted her ceremonial robes, her 6 arms fidgeting with the complex diplomatic protocols that had governed interstellar relations for over 3. The familiar weight of tradition felt heavier today, pressed down by the unprecedented crisis that had brought them all together. At the center of the great chamber sat an empty seat. The human delegation's chair remained vacant, its simple design a stark contrast to the elaborate thrones and floating platforms that housed the other species. The absence spoke louder than any speech could have. For the first time in the Assembly's recorded history, a member species had formally rejected a direct diplomatic summons. Supreme Chancellor K, the ancient cetacean whose massive form floated in a specialized gravity tank, raised his sonar-enhanced voice to address the gathering. The translation matrices hummed to life, converting his subsonic communications into the myriad languages of the Assembly. Honored delegates, his words rippled through the chamber, we convene today under the shadow of unprecedented defiance. The human species, admitted to our Assembly merely 2 centuries ago, has committed acts that shake the very foundation of our civilization. A murmur of agreement swept through the assembled delegates. The wind dancers swirled in agitation, their gaseous forms creating small atmospheric disturbances. The crystalline shard folk chimed in harmonious disapproval, while the hive speakers clicked their mandibles in synchronized displeasure. Ambassador Ra rose from her seat, her multiple arms gesturing in the traditional request for recognition. Supreme Chancellor, if I may address the Assembly. The floor recognizes the distinguished representative of the Empire, Kay rumbled. Ra's voice carried across the chamber with practiced authority. Fellow beings of peace, we gather today not merely to discuss human defiance, but to confront a fundamental threat to everything we have built. For 3,000 years, our Assembly has maintained galactic harmony through the sacred principles of diplomatic negotiation, economic interdependence, and the absolute sovereignty of the collective over the individual. She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. The humans have violated every one of these principles. When the border dispute between the Commerce Guild and the Tau Mining Consortium threatened to destabilize the entire outer spiral, what did the humans do? They ignored our carefully crafted mediation protocols. Instead of bringing the matter before this assembly, they deployed their military forces to impose what they called peace. The chamber erupted in outraged calls from various species. The delegate, a tall, thin being with skin like polished metal, stood to speak. The humans destroyed 3 months of delicate negotiations with their barbaric intervention. They simply declared that both sides would cease hostilities or face consequences. No discussion, no compromise, no respect for our established procedures. And it worked, came a quiet voice from the back of the chamber. All heads turned toward the speaker, a small, skinned being from one of the minor systems. The fighting stopped. The mining stations were returned to operation. The trade routes reopened. Thousands of lives were saved. Chancellor K's massive form shifted uncomfortably in his tank. Delegate, while the immediate results may have appeared beneficial, the precedent set by human actions threatens our entire system of governance. We cannot allow individual species to bypass established protocols, no matter how expedient their methods might seem. Ambassador Ra seized the moment. Precisely, Supreme Chancellor. But the border incident was merely the beginning. The humans have systematically dismantled our carefully constructed balance of power. When they attempted to expand their territory into the protected systems of the peaceful garden worlds, the humans didn't file a formal complaint or request assembly intervention. They simply told the to withdraw. And when they refused, asked delegate, the humans destroyed their entire invasion fleet, Ra replied, her voice heavy with implications. Not captured, not disabled, destroyed. They made no distinction between military vessels and support craft. They showed no mercy for wounded enemies. They fought like savages. A chill settled over the assembly. The concept of total warfare had been largely eliminated from galactic civilization for. Conflicts were settled through economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and carefully limited military actions designed to minimize casualties while achieving political objectives. The idea of fighting to completely destroy an enemy force was almost incomprehensible to most species. The delegate, a tall, ethereal being whose form seemed to shimmer between dimensions, spoke in a voice like distant music. The humans contacted us before the battle. They offered one final opportunity for withdrawal. We believed they were bluffing. Our intelligence suggested that humans, like all civilized species, would engage in proportional response, seek negotiated settlements, show mercy to defeated enemies. Instead, they proved that our intelligence was catastrophically wrong, Ra continued. The humans don't think like civilized beings. They approach conflict with a mindset that belongs in the dark ages of galactic history. They see war not as a tool of politics, but as a means of absolute resolution. Chancellor K's sonar pulses grew more agitated. The human response to our summons confirms this assessment. Rather than sending their delegation to explain their actions, they transmitted a simple message. The Assembly's concerns are noted. Humanity will continue to act in accordance with human interests and human values. Any attempts to interfere with human territory or human citizens will be met with appropriate response. The arrogance of the message sent another wave of outrage through the chamber. Several species began speaking simultaneously, their translations creating a cacophony of indignation. Order, K's voice boomed above the chaos. We will address this crisis through proper channels and established procedures. The human rejection of diplomatic protocol cannot be allowed to spread to other species. Ambassador Ra raised her arms again. Supreme Chancellor, I motion for immediate economic sanctions against human space, complete trade embargo, suspension of all technological exchanges, and formal diplomatic isolation until they comply with Assembly authority. Seconded, called out the delegate. Seconded, echoed the representative. Within moments, representatives from dozens of major civilizations had voiced their support. The motion seemed certain to pass until delegates stood again. I request permission to address the Assembly before the vote, the small delegate said quietly. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the chamber. People were among the smallest and least influential members of the Assembly. They rarely spoke during major debates, preferring to follow the lead of larger civilizations. Recognized, Chancellor K said, though his tone suggested reluctance. Walked to the center of the chamber, a tiny figure dwarfed by the massive space around him. Honored delegates, before we take action that may have far-reaching consequences, perhaps we should consider why the humans act as they do. Their motivations are irrelevant, Ambassador Ra interrupted. Their actions threaten galactic stability. Do they? Asked. The outer spiral has been more peaceful in the last 50 years than in the previous 5 centuries. Piracy has virtually disappeared from human-patrolled space. The slave trade that once flourished in the Rim territories has been completely eliminated. Worlds that were once considered too dangerous for civilized contact now welcome visitors from across the galaxy. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. The improvements described were well documented, but acknowledging them would complicate the narrative of human barbarism. These benefits came at the cost of proper procedure, Ra insisted. The humans achieved their results through violence and intimidation, not through the civilized methods that have served our galaxy for. Nodded slowly. Yes, they used methods we consider primitive, but perhaps we should ask ourselves why our civilized methods failed to address these problems for so long. How many worlds suffered under expansion while we debated proper response protocols? How many beings died in the border conflicts while we crafted careful compromise proposals? The chamber fell silent. The questions raised touched on uncomfortable truths that most delegates preferred not to examine too closely. The humans are different from us, continued. They think differently, they act differently, and they value different things, but difference doesn't necessarily mean wrong. Perhaps instead of demanding that they conform to our ways, we should try to understand theirs. Ambassador Ra's 6 arms gestured dismissively. Understanding is irrelevant when their actions threaten the entire framework of galactic civilization. The humans must be brought to heel before their barbarism spreads to other species. And if they refuse, asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Everyone in the chamber knew that humanity had proven remarkably resistant to the usual forms of pressure applied by the Assembly. Economic sanctions had little effect on a species that maintained largely self-sufficient colony worlds. Diplomatic isolation meant nothing to beings who seemed to prefer direct action to endless negotiations. Then we will take stronger measures, Ra declared. The assembly commands the combined military might of thousands of worlds. Surely the humans cannot stand against such overwhelming force. Are we seriously considering military action against a member species? The voice belonged to Ambassador of the Serpentine Coalition. Her scaled form coiled in an elaborate pattern that indicated deep concern. Chancellor K's sonar pulses slowed to a deliberate rhythm. No formal military proposals have been submitted. However, all options must remain available if the humans continue to reject assembly authority. Delegate remained standing in the center of the chamber. Before we commit to any course of action, might I suggest we actually attempt to communicate with the humans, not through formal summons or diplomatic ultimatums, but through genuine dialogue. They rejected our summons, Ra pointed out. They rejected our demand that they appear before us to explain their actions, corrected. Perhaps, if we approach them as equals seeking understanding rather than as superiors demanding justification, we might receive a different response. The suggestion sparked heated debate throughout the chamber. For many species, the idea of treating humans as equals rather than junior members requiring guidance was difficult to accept. Humanity had been part of galactic civilization for barely 2 centuries, a mere instant compared to that established species had spent developing their cultures and technologies. I volunteer to lead such a mission, announced suddenly. My people have had limited but positive contact with human traders and explorers. Perhaps that experience might prove valuable in establishing meaningful communication. Ambassador Ra's multiple arms moved in patterns of dismissal and disdain. They are hardly qualified to negotiate on behalf of the Assembly. This matter requires representatives with appropriate authority and experience. Then perhaps someone should accompany me, replied calmly. I'm not suggesting that my people handle this matter alone, but I do believe that approaching the humans with an open mind might yield better results than the confrontational stance we've adopted so far. Chancellor K considered the proposal. The political implications were complex. If a diplomatic mission failed, it would strengthen the position of those calling for stronger action against humanity. If it succeeded, it might preserve the facade of assembly authority while avoiding a potentially disastrous conflict. The Assembly will consider Delegates' proposal, Kay announced. However, we cannot delay indefinitely. The human rejection of our authority sets a dangerous precedent that threatens the stability of our entire civilization. If diplomatic efforts fail, we must be prepared to take whatever action necessary to preserve galactic order. As the session moved toward recess, delegates gathered in small groups to discuss the unprecedented situation. Some voices called for immediate military action, arguing that any delay would be seen as weakness. Others urged caution, pointing out that humanity's military capabilities remained largely unknown despite 2 centuries of membership in the Assembly. Ambassador Ra found herself surrounded by representatives from the major civilizations, all expressing support for strong action against human defiance. The longer we delay, the more emboldened they become, insisted the delegate. Already, some of the minor species are questioning whether Assembly membership provides any real benefits. Exactly, Ra agreed. If we allow the humans to ignore our authority with impunity, how long before other species begin to follow their example? The entire system of galactic governance depends on universal acceptance of Assembly supremacy. Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of the chamber, Delegate found himself in conversation with representatives from several smaller civilizations. These species had less invested in the current power structure and were more willing to consider alternative approaches. The humans helped us when the plague ships threatened our worlds, mentioned Delegate of the Aquatic Republics. They didn't ask for formal authorization or submit proper paperwork. They just came and fought until the threat was eliminated. Same with the void wraiths that were terrorizing our shipping lanes, added another representative. Human patrol ships drove them off when Assembly security forces said the matter was under review. Listen to these accounts with growing understanding. The pattern was clear. While the major civilizations debated procedure and protocol, real problems continued to threaten the smaller, less powerful members of galactic society. The humans had simply chosen to address those problems directly rather than wait for the elaborate machinery of Assembly bureaucracy to eventually produce action. As the recess ended and delegates returned to their seats, The tension in the chamber had grown more pronounced. The fundamental question facing the assembly was becoming clearer. Would they find a way to accommodate humanity's different approach to galactic affairs, or would they attempt to force human compliance through economic and military pressure? Chancellor K called the session back to order, his massive form shifting in the gravity tank as he prepared to address the critical decisions ahead. The Assembly must now decide how to respond to the human crisis. The motion for economic sanctions remains before us, and additional proposals may be submitted for consideration. Ambassador Ra rose immediately. Supreme Chancellor, I wish to submit a formal proposal for the creation of a compliance enforcement fleet, authorized to take whatever military action necessary to ensure that all member species respect Assembly authority. The proposal sent shockwaves through the chamber. While military action had been discussed in private conversations, the formal suggestion of creating a fleet specifically designed to enforce compliance against member species represented a fundamental change in how the Assembly operated. Delegates stood again. Supreme Chancellor, I renew my request for authorization to lead a diplomatic mission to human space. Give dialogue one chance before we resort to force. As debates raged around them, few delegates noticed the small, discreet communication devices that several members were using to contact their home governments. The crisis in the Assembly was rapidly becoming a galaxy-wide concern, and decisions made in the coming hours might determine whether the next chapter of galactic history would be written in ink or blood. The great crystal dome above them showed the swirling patterns of nearby star systems, each light representing billions of lives that would be affected by whatever the Assembly chose to do next. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on every delegate, but the path forward remained unclear. Some species saw the human challenge as an opportunity to reassert traditional values and established order. Others viewed it as a chance to address long-standing problems that the Assembly had been unable or unwilling to tackle effectively. Still others simply feared that any significant change might destabilize the carefully balanced relationships that had maintained galactic peace for so long. As the debate continued, one fact became increasingly apparent. The Assembly had reached a crossroads, and the choice they made would echo through the stars for generations to come. The humans had forced a moment of decision that could no longer be postponed or referred to committee for further study. In human space, far from the grand halls of the Assembly, another kind of preparation was taking place. Admiral Sarah reviewed intelligence reports in the command center of humanity's First Fleet, her weathered face showing no emotion as she processed information about Assembly military capabilities. They still don't understand us, she said quietly to her staff. They think we rejected their summons out of arrogance or defiance. They don't realize we're simply done pretending that their way is the only way. Colonel Martinez, her chief of staff, nodded grimly. Intelligence suggests they're moving toward economic sanctions, possibly followed by military action if we don't comply. Admiral smiled without humor. Then they're about to learn something about human nature that apparently 2 centuries of contact failed to teach them. We don't respond well to ultimatums. The diplomatic mission departed Assembly space aboard a small, unassuming vessel that bore the neutral markings of the Galactic Mediation Service. Delegate had insisted on minimal escort, arguing that a show of force would undermine any attempt at genuine dialogue. His only companion was ambassador of the Serpentine Coalition, whose reputation for skilled negotiation had made her an obvious choice for the mission. As their ship approached the outer perimeter of human space, both delegates studied the intelligence briefings they had been provided. The data painted a picture of a species unlike any other in the galaxy, one whose rapid expansion and aggressive territorial defense had caught established civilizations off guard. Look at these population statistics, observed, her forked tongue flicking nervously. In just 2 centuries, they've established over 300 colony worlds. Most species take to achieve that level of expansion. Nodded thoughtfully, and noticed the pattern of their settlements. They don't establish trading posts or research stations like we do. Every human world is designed to be completely self-sufficient within a generation. They're not building an empire, they're creating a civilization that can survive independently. Why would they do that unless they expected to be cut off from galactic society? Asked. Before could answer, their ship's communication system activated. The voice that emerged spoke in clear, unaccented galactic standard, but there was something different about the cadence, something that suggested the speaker was translating from another language. Unidentified vessel, you are entering human territorial space. Please state your business and intended destination. Activated the communication system himself. This is delegate of the people and ambassador of the Serpentine Coalition. We represent the Galactic Assembly and request permission to meet with human leadership for the purpose of diplomatic dialogue. A long pause followed. When the voice returned, it carried a note of surprise. Did you say diplomatic dialogue, not demands for compliance or threats of sanctions? We wish only to understand the human perspective and explore possibilities for peaceful resolution of current tensions, replied carefully. Another pause, then a different voice took over the communication. This one was female and carried an unmistakable tone of authority. This is Admiral of the Human Defense Force. Delegates, you are cleared to proceed to Titan Station in the Sol system. Please follow the navigation beacon that is now being transmitted to your ship. Be aware that you will be escorted by human defense vessels from this point forward. Within minutes, 2 sleek warships appeared alongside their diplomatic vessel. Studied them through the observation ports, her scaled form coiling with unease. I've never seen ships designed like that, she whispered. No elegant curves, no artistic elements, no wasted space. They look like they were built for one purpose only. Fighting, agreed quietly. Everything about them suggests efficiency and lethality. No wonder the fleet was destroyed so quickly. As they traveled deeper into human space, both delegates were struck by what they observed. Human worlds were heavily defended, with orbital platforms and patrol ships maintaining constant watch. But the defenses were arranged differently than those of other species, focused not just on protecting valuable installations, but on creating overlapping fields of fire that would make any attack prohibitively costly. They don't just defend their worlds, observed. They make them into fortresses. More disturbing was what they didn't see. Most spacefaring civilizations filled their territory with the usual infrastructure of galactic society: trade stations, diplomatic facilities, cultural exchange centers, tourist destinations. Human space contained none of these amenities. Everything seemed focused on production, defense, and expansion. When they finally reached Sol system, both delegates felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold vacuum of space. The system contained more military vessels than some species possessed in their entire fleets. Massive industrial complexes orbited every major planet, their output clearly dedicated to supporting humanity's rapid expansion. How many ships do they have? Asked in wonder. Consulted his scanner readings. I'm detecting over 2,000 military vessels just in this system alone, and these appear to be frontline warships, not patrol boats or system defense craft. Titan Station proved to be a massive installation that dwarfed most planetary capitals. As their shuttle approached the docking bay, they could see the constant traffic of military and civilian vessels coming and going. The scale of human activity was staggering. Admiral met them personally at the docking port, a gesture that both delegates appreciated. She was a tall, lean woman with streaked hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail around her. Her uniform was practical rather than decorative, designed for function rather than display. "Welcome to human space," she said simply. "I understand you wish to discuss the current situation with the Assembly." "We do," replied. "We hope to find common ground that might prevent an escalation of tensions." Admiral's expression was unreadable. "Before we begin, you should understand something about humans. We value directness over diplomacy, action over discussion, and results over procedure. If you're expecting the kind of elaborate negotiations that characterize assembly politics, you're going to be disappointed." Scales shifted colors slightly, a sign of nervousness. "We appreciate your candor, Admiral. Perhaps you could help us understand why humanity has chosen to reject assembly authority." "We haven't rejected assembly authority," Admiral replied as she led them through the station's corridors. "We've rejected the idea that the Assembly has authority over how we defend ourselves and protect our interests." The distinction seemed subtle, but sensed it was important. "Could you elaborate on that?" They entered a conference room with walls lined with tactical displays, showing human military deployments across dozens of systems. Admiral gestured for them to sit before taking her own seat across from them. The assembly operates on the principle that all conflicts can be resolved through negotiation, that all problems can be solved through compromise, and that the threat of economic or political pressure will eventually force compliance with collective decisions, she began. For most species, this approach works because you all share similar values and similar approaches to conflict resolution. But humans are different, asked. Fundamentally different, Admiral confirmed. We've spent our entire evolutionary history in conflict with our environment, with predators, with disease, and with each other. We developed as a species that solves problems through direct action rather than endless discussion. She activated one of the displays, which showed a map of recent conflicts in assembly space. When they began expanding into the garden worlds, what did the assembly do? They convened committees, they issued statements of concern, they proposed mediation frameworks. Meanwhile, peaceful civilizations were being conquered and enslaved. The assembly was working toward a negotiated solution, protested. How long would that have taken? Admiral asked bluntly. Months, years. How many beings would have suffered or died while the assembly debated proper procedures? Shifted uncomfortably. The question struck at one of the central weaknesses of assembly governance, the gap between political process and practical results. We solved the problem in 3 days, Admiral continued. We told them to withdraw or face the consequences. When they refused, we made good on our threat. The expansion stopped, the conquered worlds were liberated, and the threat was eliminated. Through violence, pointed out. Through the credible threat of violence, Admiral corrected. They could have withdrawn at any time and avoided conflict entirely. They chose to fight because they believed, like most assembly species, that humans would eventually back down and seek compromise. Study the tactical displays around them. Your military preparations suggest you expect more conflicts. We expect to be challenged, Admiral replied. The assembly has maintained peace for 3 by ensuring that no single species becomes powerful enough to threaten the established order. Our rapid expansion and military buildup represents exactly the kind of threat that the assembly traditionally moves to contain. So you're preparing for war with the assembly? Asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We're preparing to defend ourselves if the assembly chooses war, Admiral said calmly. We hope that won't be necessary, but we're not going to leave our survival to chance or trust in the good intentions of others. The cold pragmatism of the statement sent chills through both delegates. The possibility of actual warfare between humanity and the rest of the galaxy had seemed almost unthinkable, but Admiral spoke of it as simply another contingency to plan for. Surely there must be some middle ground, insisted. Some way for humanity to coexist with the rest of galactic civilization without abandoning either human values or assembly principles. Admiral considered the question seriously. Perhaps, but that would require the assembly to acknowledge that their way isn't the only way and that human methods, while different, can be effective. It would also require acceptance that some problems require direct action rather than endless negotiation. What kind of problems? Asked. Admiral activated another display, this one showing piracy statistics for the past century. When we arrived in galactic space, pirate fleets roamed freely through the outer systems, preying on merchant vessels and isolated colonies. The Assembly's response was to form study committees and propose trade route modifications. We chose to hunt down and destroy every pirate base we could find. The statistical comparison was striking. In human-controlled space, piracy had virtually disappeared. In areas still under traditional assembly protection, it continued at historical levels. Or consider the slave trade, Admiral continued, bringing up another display. For centuries, certain species have engaged in the capture and sale of sentient beings from less developed worlds. The Assembly condemned the practice, imposed symbolic sanctions, and called for voluntary compliance. The trade continued because the profits outweighed the minimal penalties. What did humans do differently? Asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. We issued one warning to known slave traders: cease operations or be destroyed. When they ignored us, we made good on the threat. Every slave ship we encountered was destroyed with all hands. Every slave market was burned to the ground. Every trader who participated in the business was hunted down and killed. The casual mention of summary execution shocked both delegates. The concept of killing defeated enemies was almost incomprehensible to most galactic civilizations. That's murder, whispered. That's justice, Admiral replied without emotion. The beings who engaged in slavery chose their fate when they decided to profit from the suffering of others. They could have chosen differently at any time. Tried to process what he was hearing. The human approach to justice was indeed fundamentally different from anything he had encountered. Where other species sought rehabilitation, compensation, or symbolic punishment, humans apparently believed in permanent solutions. But doesn't this approach create cycles of violence? He asked. Don't the families and allies of those you kill seek revenge? Admiral smiled grimly. Dead enemies don't seek revenge, and their families quickly learn that certain activities carry unacceptable risks. Word spreads fast when the consequences are clear and immediate. The conversation was interrupted by an aide who entered the conference room and whispered something to Admiral. Her expression darkened as she listened. It seems the Assembly has voted to impose economic sanctions against human space, she announced after the aide left. All trade agreements are suspended, all technological exchanges are terminated, and member species are forbidden from any commercial contact with human worlds. Both delegates looked stricken, had hoped that his diplomatic mission might prevent such escalation. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I had hoped we could reach understanding before matters went this far. Admiral's response surprised them both. She laughed, not the bitter laugh of someone facing disaster, but genuine amusement. Do they really think economic pressure will force us to comply? She asked. Have they learned nothing about human psychology in 2 centuries of contact? Economic sanctions have proven effective against other species, pointed out. Other species that depend on galactic trade for their survival, Admiral replied. We designed our civilization to be self-sufficient precisely because we expected this day would come. Every human world can produce everything it needs to survive and prosper. We trade with the galaxy for convenience, not necessity. The implications hit both delegates simultaneously. If economic pressure couldn't force human compliance, the Assembly would have to choose between accepting human independence or resorting to military action. What happens now? Asked. Now we wait to see whether the Assembly is willing to escalate further, Admiral replied. If they choose military action, we'll respond appropriately. If they choose to accept that different species can coexist without uniform governance, we're open to establishing a new relationship based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority. And if the Assembly refuses both options? Admiral's expression grew cold. Then they'll discover what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object. As if summoned by her words, another aide entered with an urgent message. Admiral read it quickly, her jaw tightening with each line. It seems Ambassador Ra has convinced the Assembly to authorize the creation of a compliance enforcement fleet, she announced. They're mobilizing ships from across the galaxy to force human submission. The news hit the room like a physical blow. Both delegates understood the implications immediately. The Assembly was preparing for war. How many ships? Asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. According to this intelligence report, approximately 50,000 vessels from over 200 different species, Admiral replied calmly. The largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. The number was staggering. Even if most of the ships were smaller patrol craft or support vessels, the sheer size of the fleet represented overwhelming force by any conventional measure. You can't possibly fight against such numbers, protested. Surely you'll reconsider your position now that the stakes have become so clear. Admiral stood and walked to one of the tactical displays. You're making the same mistake the Assembly has made for 2 centuries. You're assuming that humans think like other species, that will back down when faced with superior numbers. She input a series of commands, and the display changed to show human military deployments. We've been preparing for this possibility since the day we joined the Assembly. Every human world is heavily fortified. Every system has overlapping defensive zones. Every ship in our fleet is designed to inflict maximum damage before being destroyed. But 50,000 ships, began, will find themselves facing an enemy that refuses to lose, Admiral interrupted. The Assembly species fight to achieve political objectives. They seek to minimize casualties and preserve valuable assets. They negotiate when the cost of victory becomes too high. She turned to face both delegates directly. Humans fight to survive. We don't surrender when the odds turn against us. We don't seek negotiated solutions when our existence is threatened. We fight until we win or until we're all dead. The absolute certainty in her voice was terrifying. Both delegates realized they were looking at a species that approached warfare with a fundamentally different mindset than anything the galaxy had seen for. There has to be another way, pleaded. Some alternative that doesn't require the destruction of civilizations. There is, Admiral replied. The Assembly could choose to respect human autonomy and accept that different species have different approaches to governance and conflict resolution. They could establish relationships with humanity based on equality rather than subordination. And if they won't? Admiral's expression was grim but determined. Then they'll learn what it means to fight a species that has spent its entire history preparing for exactly this kind of struggle. They'll discover that sometimes, when you try to break something that refuses to bend, you end up destroying more than you bargained for. As the weight of the situation settled over the room, all three beings understood that they had reached a point of no return. The choices made in the coming days would determine whether the galaxy's future would be shaped by negotiation or by the ancient logic of survival and dominance. The great experiment in galactic democracy was about to face its ultimate test, and the outcome would echo through the stars for generations to come. The assembled fleet was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Stretching across 3 light-years of space, 50,000 vessels from across the galaxy gathered under the banner of Assembly authority. Massive dreadnoughts from the Empire floated alongside sleek destroyers from the Commerce Guild. Crystalline shardfolk vessels sang in harmonious formations, while cetacean command ships coordinated the largest military operation in galactic history. Admiral Ra stood on the bridge of the flagship Unity's Resolve, her 6 arms working multiple control interfaces as she reviewed the final deployment orders. Around her, officers from dozens of species coordinated their forces with practiced efficiency. The diversity of the fleet was both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness, but careful planning and superior numbers would overcome any tactical disadvantages. "Status report from all battle groups," she commanded, her voice carrying across the command center through universal translators. "First battle group reports ready for engagement," came the response from a tactical officer. 200 capital ships, escort formations in position. "Second battle group confirms readiness," added in communications specialist. "Long-range bombardment units standing by." The reports continued as each of the 20 battle groups confirmed their preparations. The sheer scale of the operation was unprecedented. Never in the history of galactic civilization had so many species united for military action. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet," announced the communications officer, a tall, thin being from one of the aquatic worlds. "Put it through," Ra ordered. The main display activated, revealing the image of Admiral standing on what appeared to be the bridge of a human warship. Her expression was calm, almost casual, as if she were discussing routine shipping schedules rather than facing the largest military force in galactic history. "Admiral Ra," began, "I assume you're here to demand our surrender and submission to Assembly authority." "I'm here to restore galactic order," Ra replied formally. "The Assembly offers one final opportunity for peaceful resolution. Submit to our jurisdiction, accept Assembly oversight of your military forces, and agree to abide by all future Assembly decisions without reservation." Admiral smiled without humor. "And if we refuse?" "Then we will use whatever force necessary to ensure compliance," Ra stated. "You face 50,000 ships, Admiral. Surely even human stubbornness has limits." "You'd think so, wouldn't you?" replied. "Unfortunately, you're about to discover that human psychology doesn't work the way you expect. We have a saying, the more you tighten your grip, the more star systems will slip through your fingers." The reference was lost on most of the alien officers, but the meaning was clear enough. Ra felt a flutter of unease as she studied completely calm demeanor. Either the human admiral was an exceptional actor, or she genuinely believed her forces could survive the coming battle. "Admiral, you command perhaps 5,000 ships," Ra pointed out. "We outnumber you 10 to 1. Your defiance is admirable but futile." "Numbers don't always determine victory," replied. Sometimes, the side that's willing to pay any price to win has advantages that can't be measured in ship counts or weapon statistics. Before Ra could respond, tactical alarms began sounding throughout the command center. Officers turned to their instruments with expressions of confusion and growing concern. "Admiral, we're detecting massive energy signatures from the human fleet," the tactical officer reported. "Their ships are powering weapon systems that exceed our intelligence estimates by several orders of magnitude." Ra activated her own tactical display, studying the readings with growing disbelief. "That's impossible. No ship that size could generate that much power." On the main screen, Admiral's smile widened. "Did you really think we spent 2 centuries in galactic society without learning anything? We studied your technologies, your tactics, your weapons. Then we improved on everything." The first human ships began moving forward, and the readings on assembly instruments went from concerning to alarming. Each vessel was generating power signatures comparable to the largest assembly dreadnoughts, despite being considerably smaller. "How is this possible?" Ra demanded. "Humans don't just use technology," explained. "We push it beyond its intended limits. We find ways to make everything more efficient, more powerful, more deadly. It's what we do." "Admiral, human ships are launching what appear to be missile barrages," the tactical officer announced. "Number of projectiles, this can't be right." "What are you reading?" Ra demanded. "Over 1 million individual missiles, all accelerating at impossible velocities. They're armed with warheads that read as, I don't know what these readings mean." Admiral's image leaned forward slightly. "Those are something we developed specifically for this occasion. We call them planet crackers. Each one carries enough destructive power to sterilize a world." The casual mention of planet-killing weapons sent shockwaves through the command center. Such weapons were banned by every treaty in galactic space, considered too dangerous for civilized warfare. "You can't use weapons of mass destruction against populated worlds," Ra protested. "That violates every principle of civilized warfare." "We're not targeting populated worlds," replied calmly. "We're targeting your fleet. Each of those missiles is programmed to take out multiple capital ships. We figure 1 million missiles should be enough to handle 50,000 targets with plenty of redundancy." The mathematics were simple and terrifying. If each missile could destroy even one ship, the assembly fleet faced complete annihilation. But planet cracker warheads designed for multiple targets suggested casualties far beyond anything the galaxy had seen for. "This is genocide," Ra whispered. "This is war," corrected. "You brought the largest military force in galactic history to our doorstep and demanded our surrender. Did you expect us to respond with harsh language and diplomatic protests?" Tactical displays throughout the command center began showing missile trajectories and impact predictions. The numbers were catastrophic. Even if the assembly fleet managed to destroy 90% of the incoming missiles, the remaining weapons would inflict devastating casualties. "All ships emergency evasion," Ra commanded. "Deploy countermeasures and prepare for impact." Across 3 light-years of space, 50,000 vessels began frantic maneuvers as their crews realized the magnitude of the threat bearing down on them. Point defense systems activated, launching clouds of interceptor missiles and defensive energy blasts. But the sheer number of incoming weapons made effective defense almost impossible. "Admiral, we're receiving surrender requests from multiple battle groups," the communications officer reported. "They're requesting permission to withdraw from the engagement zone." Ross stared at the tactical displays in growing horror. The carefully planned operation was collapsing before it had truly begun. The psychological impact of facing planet-killer weapons was devastating fleet morale faster than any actual damage. "Negative," she commanded. "All ships will maintain formation and engage the enemy. We cannot allow human defiance to succeed." But even as she gave the order, Ra knew it was too late. The assembly fleet had been designed for the kind of limited conflicts that characterized galactic warfare for carefully controlled engagements with minimal casualties and clear political objectives. The prospect of facing an enemy willing to use unlimited force was beyond their psychological and tactical preparation. On the main screen, Admiral watched the chaos spreading through the assembly formation with cold satisfaction. "Your ships are beginning to break formation, Admiral. Perhaps you should reconsider your position before this gets any worse." "We will not be intimidated by terrorist tactics," Ra declared, though her voice lacked conviction. "These aren't terrorist tactics," replied. "This is total war, the kind of conflict that emerges when one side seeks the complete destruction of the other. You can still avoid it by withdrawing your forces and returning to assembly space." The first wave of human missiles began reaching their targets. The results were exactly as devastating as predicted. Each warhead that found its mark completely vaporized its target, leaving nothing but expanding clouds of superheated gas. Within minutes, the assembly fleet had lost over 3,000 ships. "Admiral, we're receiving massive casualty reports," the communications officer announced, his voice shaking. "First battle group has lost 60% of its ships. Second battle group is reporting similar losses. Fleet commanders are requesting permission to retreat." Ra watched her carefully assembled force disintegrate under the human assault. The survivors were scattered across space, their formations broken, their morale shattered. The largest military force in galactic history was being systematically destroyed by an enemy that fought with rules no civilized species could comprehend. "All ships begin withdrawal to minimum safe distance," she finally commanded. "Maintain defensive formations and prepare to regroup." The order to retreat sent visible relief through the command center. Officers who had spent their careers managing limited conflicts with clear rules and minimal casualties had never imagined facing an enemy that approached warfare as a matter of species survival. Admiral's image remained on the main screen as the assembly fleet began its withdrawal. "A wise decision, Admiral, but before you go, you should understand something about human psychology that your intelligence reports apparently missed." "What?" Ra asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "You came here expecting to intimidate us into submission through superior numbers. You believed that facing overwhelming force would convince us to accept assembly authority, but you made one critical error in your calculations." Paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "Humans don't submit when faced with overwhelming odds. We get angry, and angry humans are the most dangerous force in the known universe." As if summoned by her words, new contacts began appearing on assembly sensors. More human ships were emerging from deep space, their configurations unlike anything in the intelligence files. "Admiral, we're detecting approximately 2,000 additional human vessels approaching from multiple vectors," the tactical officer reported. "These ships are..." "They're massive, larger than anything in our fleet." "You've seen our regular navy," explained. "Now you get to meet our siege fleet. Those ships you're detecting aren't designed for normal military operations. They're designed to crack open planetary defenses and sterilize entire star systems. We call them world enders." The implications were staggering. The assembly fleet was already retreating from conventional human forces. The arrival of even more powerful vessels made any thought of continued resistance impossible. "What do you want?" Ra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What we've always wanted," replied. "To be left alone to govern ourselves according to our own values and principles. We never asked to rule the galaxy or impose our will on other species. We simply refuse to submit to yours." "The Assembly will never accept human independence," Ra protested, though her heart was no longer in the argument. "The Assembly will accept whatever reality we choose to impose," replied bluntly. "You can adapt to our existence, or you can continue to oppose us and face the consequences. But you cannot force us to submit, and any attempt to do so will result in casualties you're not prepared to accept." Around the command center, officers listened to the exchange with growing understanding. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted irrevocably. The species that had maintained order were being forced to confront a new reality where their authority was no longer absolute. "What happens now?" Ra asked. "Now you return to assembly space and explain to your colleagues that some things cannot be achieved through traditional diplomatic or military pressure," replied. "You tell them that humans are willing to coexist peacefully with the galaxy, but only as equals, not as subjects." The transmission ended, leaving the assembly command center in stunned silence. The greatest military operation in galactic history had ended not in glorious victory, but in humiliating retreat. The implications would echo through the corridors of power across 1,000 worlds. As the battered assembly fleet limped back toward home, word of the engagement spread throughout galactic space. The reaction was swift and dramatic. Some species called for immediate escalation, demanding that even greater force be brought to bear against human defiance. Others quietly began reconsidering their own relationships with assembly authority. On dozens of worlds, subject species that had chafed under assembly rule began asking uncomfortable questions. If humans could successfully resist galactic authority, what prevented other species from doing the same? The careful balance of power that had maintained stability began to show cracks. In the great halls of the Galactic Assembly, emergency sessions convened as delegates struggled to comprehend what had occurred. The carefully crafted narrative of assembly supremacy lay in ruins, destroyed by a species that refused to accept the rules of galactic civilization. Ambassador, recently returned from her diplomatic mission to human space, found herself at the center of increasingly desperate discussions. Her first-hand knowledge of human capabilities made her one of the few voices arguing against further military action. "They're not bluffing," she told the assembled delegates. "They've prepared for this conflict for 2 centuries. Every human world is a fortress, every ship is a weapon, every citizen is a potential soldier. They don't fight wars the way we do." "How do they fight?" demanded the representative, his ethereal form shimmering with agitation. "To win," replied simply. "Not to achieve limited political objectives or maintain favorable trade relationships. They fight to completely destroy their enemies and ensure their own survival. The concept of acceptable losses doesn't exist in their military doctrine." Delegate, who had initially proposed diplomatic engagement, rose from his seat with visible effort. The weight of recent events had aged him considerably. "Perhaps it's time we acknowledge that our approach to galactic governance has fundamental limitations," he said quietly. "For 3,000 years, we've maintained peace by ensuring that no single species could challenge our collective authority. But we've also created a system where innovation is discouraged, where different approaches to problem-solving are suppressed, where the status is maintained regardless of its effectiveness." His words sent uncomfortable murmurs through the chamber. The suggestion that assembly methods might be flawed struck at the core of galactic civilization's self-image. "The humans have shown us that some problems require direct action rather than endless negotiation," continued. "They've eliminated piracy, ended the slave trade, and brought stability to regions that had suffered conflict for centuries. Perhaps instead of trying to force them to conform to our methods, we should consider learning from theirs." Chancellor K's massive form shifted in his gravity tank. "Are you suggesting we abandon 3 of diplomatic tradition in favor of human militarism?" "I'm suggesting we acknowledge that different challenges require different approaches," replied. "The humans aren't trying to conquer the galaxy or impose their will on other species. They simply want the right to govern themselves according to their own principles." The debate continued for hours, but the fundamental reality had changed. The Assembly could no longer claim absolute authority over all member species. The human resistance had proved that force alone was insufficient to ensure compliance, and the cost of attempting to crush human independence was higher than most species were willing to pay. In the end, the Assembly faced a choice that would define the future of galactic civilization. They could continue to demand universal submission and face the prospect of more species following humanity's example of successful resistance. Or they could adapt their governance model to accommodate different approaches to civilization and conflict resolution. The decision, when it finally came, was not unanimous. Many species continued to call for stronger action against human defiance. But a growing number of delegates recognized that the galaxy had entered a new era, one where the old certainties no longer applied. The formal resolution, passed by the narrowest of margins, established a new category of membership in the Galactic Assembly. Autonomous associates would be bound by certain fundamental laws governing interaction between species, but would maintain internal sovereignty over their own territories and citizens. Humanity became the first species granted this status, setting a precedent that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. The great experiment in universal democracy had evolved into something more complex, more challenging, but perhaps more resilient. As news of the resolution spread throughout human space, Admiral stood once again on the bridge of her flagship, watching the last assembly vessels disappear into hyperspace. Her staff waited for orders, uncertain whether the crisis had truly ended or merely entered a new phase. "What are your orders, Admiral?" her executive officer asked. Was quiet for a long moment, contemplating the weight of what humanity had accomplished and the responsibilities that came with their hard-won independence. "Send a message to all human worlds," she finally commanded. "The immediate threat has passed, but our vigilance must continue. We've proven that freedom can be defended, but we must never forget the cost of that defense." She paused, looking out at the stars that now represented both opportunity and ongoing challenge. "And send a message to any species that chooses to follow our example. The galaxy is large enough for different approaches to civilization, but the price of independence is eternal vigilance. Those who choose freedom must be prepared to defend it." As the messages went out across human space and beyond, the galaxy began to adjust to its new reality. The age of absolute assembly authority had ended, replaced by something more complex, but perhaps more honest about the nature of interstellar relations. The humans had won their independence not through conquest or domination, but by proving that some prices were too high to pay and some spirits too strong to break. The stars themselves seemed brighter as a new chapter in galactic history began to unfold.